Plan on flying? In order to board domestic flights, your driver's license or state-issued ID must be a real ID. Learn how to get your real ID today at tsa.gov/realid or visit your local DMV.
Guys, if you guys love reading books, make sure to check out Audible and use my link audibletrial.com/dime for a free 30-day trial. Guys, make sure to check out W Energy, an energy drink company with no artificial colors, sugars, or calories. And guess what? It can fuel up your whole day. Trust me, use my promo code DiamondGo for 10% off for every purchase you make. If you guys are a fan of my podcast clips, I think you guys should go check out Opus Clips, a website where you can upload your whole podcast episode and split it into 30 short clips to increase your engagement. Use my link for 30% off for the first month of a pro plan. Just use my link opus.pro/DiamondGo30.
Pretty thighs, shawty, she a dime. Demon girl, evil eyes, she be telling lies.
All right, so today it is my pleasure to interview Dr. Leslie Leinwand, the Chief Scientific Officer of the BioFrontiers at the University of Colorado. So Dr. Leinwand, thanks for being part of this episode. So can you start you taking us back and telling us about your background?
Absolutely. So I've listened to a few of your podcasts, and I know generally the direction that some of them have taken. So I think that being a scientist is one of the best things that a person can do. I love what I do, and I always have. I grew up in an interesting part of the country in the United States, which was South Carolina. And I came from a family where my stepfather didn't think that women should go to college. My stepbrother went to Duke, and I went to a college in North Carolina that was quite religious. And I had the good fortune of having a biology professor who saw how interested I was in science. And he took me aside one day and said, "You've got to get out of here, and I'm going to help you." So he required of my family that I go to Cornell University in upstate New York to take organic chemistry during summer school. And my family did not recognize that he did not have any authority to require that I go to Cornell for summer school. They thought that he could do that. And so I went to summer school there, and I saw what being at a big university that valued science tremendously, what that was like. And so I transferred to Cornell. Ended up in graduate school at Yale, and then did a postdoc at Rockefeller University. It was clear to me from the beginning that I wanted to work in an area of science that might translate into treatments for genetic diseases. My PhD was in human genetics, and I wanted to work on genes that cause disease, and I picked the heart and skeletal muscle because they're both striated muscles, and there are lots and lots of inherited myopathies that result from some of these mutations. I have started, I've been a co-founder of 4 biotech companies. We just became known from not being a stealth company to being a company that we can talk about now. So that just happened a couple of weeks ago. And I have found this cooperation between academic labs and biotech to be really, really exciting. So being able to have one foot in each of those two environments has been true now for me since probably 1996 or 7. So my first biotech company was called Myogen, and we were trying to develop treatments for heart failure, which is the number one killer of people in the US. And it comes at huge economic cost as well as the quality of life cost. Our company did really quite well, and we were bought by Gilead in 2006. We had a couple of treatments for diseases that they wanted to acquire. My third company the second one was mostly a virtual company. My third company was one called Myokardia, and we developed an FDA-approved drug for a disease whose only treatment was heart transplant. And so there aren't enough hearts to go around. And so we developed a drug for this. And the disease has a long name. It's hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. And all that means is a big, sick heart. But it's notable because of the fact that sometimes the first symptom that you have is sudden death. And it is the leading cause of sudden death in young people. So the FDA and the community were both very excited about the prospect that we might develop such a drug. And so our drug was approved, and our company then was bought. I guess the company was bought first 2 years before the approval came through, and that was Bristol Myers Squibb bought us.
Mhm.
And I love the idea of starting another company, and hence the new one that I've just started.
Mhm. Yeah, so I want to go back to Myogen. So when you said you guys were doing well, I just want to know, like, you guys were earning money because it's really hard for a biotech startup to be doing well. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah,
Like
so
a lot of them are bleeding money.
oh yeah, yeah. And Myogen, I learned a lot. I had a mentor who had already founded multiple biotech companies. He was at the time chief of cardiology at the University of Colorado. His name is Mike Bristow. And he asked me if I was interested in starting a company. And I had never even thought about something like that. And I said to him, I don't know anything about starting a company. And he said, well, but I do, and I can teach you. And so he said, all we really need to do is write up a business plan. I said, okay, I don't even know what a business plan is. And so we went around raising money. We did a lot of that. It was hard, even back then. Heart disease is a very expensive disease to develop drugs for because the clinical trials are extremely expensive. And depending on which one of the heart diseases you're studying, you could have a endpoint that's mortality, meaning you have to see that you are improving the mortality rates of the people with the disease. So that could be 5 years. So it was tough. So we had an alternate strategy in the sense that we took some drugs that had been approved for one disease and then tested them in a different disease. So that's fairly common now. Back in the late 90s, that was not quite so common to do that. So we had in-house research that was high risk, that we had some money to do, and then we were running clinical trials. And one of our clinical trials failed spectacularly. And I think all of us thought the company was going to go under when that happened. Luckily, that didn't happen. And we had bought a compound that was being used for, as I mentioned, one disease, and we used it for primary pulmonary hypertension.
I see. So, like, let's say if you look back at your first company, would you have sold it to Gilead, or would you have continued Biogen to being its own company and potentially be on the stock market?
Yeah, so I think it was exactly the right time to sell it. They paid a lot of money at the time. It was the largest deal in biotech history. And so it made the front page of the Wall Street Journal when they bought us. They, in retrospect, think they overpaid for our company. I've talked to the former CEO. Nobody's going to feel too sorry for Gilead because they're kind of a giant now. But I think it was absolutely the right time to do it.
And if I'm correct, it was your company, I think Tularic was also bought for $1 billion.
Yeah, so ours was, I believe, 2.5 billion at that time, which was a long time ago.
Mm-hmm.
I always liked Tularic too.
Yeah, I actually got on the co-founders here, and he actually was even shocked that his company was bought for $1 billion because they weren't even making any money.
Yeah,
they had no products actually.
Well, and frankly, when Bristol Myers Squibb bought us, it was also a very large sum of money. I can't remember the exact dollars. I think it was $13.4 billion. Maybe it was 0.6. I don't remember. But we had a very, very forceful CEO, and we had a great idea. I mean, it was a great idea and it worked.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so let's talk about Kardia. I know it's bought for around 13 billion. So let me ask, why is BMS so interested in myocardia? Like, because I know cardiac disease isn't that much, it's not as big of a focus in the pharmaceuticals.
Yeah, so, you know, I was not part of any of those negotiations, so I can't tell you for sure. I think the point was that the idea of, quote, precision medicine, sometimes people hate that word, but the idea of tailoring treatments to the nature of the genetics was already had been proven over and over and over again in cancer. And yet it hadn't been done so much in heart disease, which is, a huge economic driver of healthcare costs, and as well as I mentioned, the high mortality. So I think that the notion of this very, very scientifically based approach, where we weren't trying to study something that was as heterogeneous, let's say, as heart failure, because you can get to heart failure by a lot of different routes. We were focusing on the genetic cardiomyopathies. And so we had a target in mind, and we set out to do exactly what we did. I mean, we didn't have to shift to something else, not even once. I mean, I think the focus was attractive, particularly at BMS, because a lot of their cancer therapies were DNA based, in the sense of, when I say DNA based, the genotype of people's tumors was being determined, and then the treatments in many cases were tailored to that. And that did work very well.
Mhm. Yeah, so I have another question just in general. It's not about our companies, but uh, if you haven't seen a trend, like more and more of these pharmaceutical giants are not making their drugs or products in-house. They're acquiring other startups, usually for the product and to make more money, like in case of Myokardia. I just want to ask your opinion. Do you think it's a bad thing that a lot of these giants aren't making their own drugs in-house?
Well, you're in college, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I've had the advantage of being around this planet for a lot longer than you have, but there are waves. This happens all the time. You see it, that there are waves where the companies want to make everything in-house, and then they want to outsource everything. And I'm sure some economist understands this. I don't understand what drives these waves, and I've seen them happen over and over again. So I think that we're in a wave right now where they're, buying up companies that do things that they aren't doing.
Mhm. Yeah, and let's talk about a journey from Myokardia, from just incorporating it to being public on NASDAQ and then being acquired. Like, what can you describe this journey? Was it kind of like raising a child, or what
Um,
was it?
no, not for me. As I mentioned, even though I hadn't thought too much about starting a company, I always, even from when I was a graduate student, wanted to do something that might translate into treatments for human genetic diseases. So that was what was driving me. And if I had not had the experience that I had at Myogen, I don't know whether it would have been as straightforward as it was for Myokardia. My colleague Jim Spudich and I were talking to each other about genetic diseases in the motor protein that makes muscles contract, myosin. And we had been working together collaboratively. He's at Stanford. And when we first started collaborating, I was at Albert Einstein College of Medicine in New York. And we had started collaborating on trying to understand how disease-causing mutations in myosin drive the disease itself. And we knew a lot about that. Myosin is one of the best studied proteins in biology, and a lot of the technologies that were developed to study it originated some in my lab, but mostly in Jim's lab at Stanford. And one day in about 2011, he called me and he said, "Do you have another company in you?" And I said, not if we have to raise it, $1 million or $2 million at a time. I don't want to do that again. And he said, no, this might be different. And so we went to our investors, our potential investors at Third Rock, and they have sites both in the Bay Area as well as in the Boston area. And we presented to some key opinion leaders, as is typical, and that, as well as to some of the partners at Third Rock. And we left the room, and they had a big discussion with the key opinion leaders and among themselves. And when they asked Jim and me to come into the room to hear what they had decided, they said, okay, we're not going to do angel investing, small sums of money. So Jim and I stood up and said, well, thank you very much. We were ready to leave. And they said, no, wait, sit back down. We're going to go through all of Series A. And you've got a lot more money than you probably thought you were going to ask for.
So you skipped seed and pre-seed.
Yep.
Then wow, that's kind of hard to just skip rounds.
So I need to say one more thing that does make that maybe a little easier to understand. So you have to keep in mind that I was a co-founder of a very successful biotech company years before on the heart. And Jim had co-founded Cytokinetics, which is another company in the Bay Area that deals with some heart and other neurological diseases as well. So we both had quite successful experiences. And in this world, as you probably know, prior success is a fairly decent indication that we probably knew what we were doing. And I don't think, as I mentioned, if I hadn't gone through that whole process at Myogen, I probably would not have even gotten in the door at some of these VCs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so your second company was Hiberna Inc.
Hiberna.
Yeah, so it looks like it went out of business. That's what I found on the website. It's like, what happened to it?
Yeah, so some of it was bandwidth on my part, meaning we were working in snakes, in Burmese pythons, because pythons have amazing biology that they've evolved to be able to do that you and I can't do. And so I still think that it has a huge amount of promise for translating things to humans. What happened was that Myokardia came along, we created Myokardia, and that seemed such a clear path towards a therapeutic that I just put that on the back burner. But there are 8 people in my lab right now working on pythons.
So it's like kind of semi-continuing.
Yeah,
but
just not as a company yet.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so let's talk about your research. I know you're doing cardiac hypertrophy with pythons. So, may I ask why you choose pythons, not like mice or rats, like the conventional type of animals?
Yeah, so I have to let you know, I did not think of this. I mean, I thought of what we're doing, but there's a famous nonfiction writer named Jared Diamond. He wrote, probably his most famous book is Guns, Germs, and Steel. It turns out that he was on the faculty at UCLA. He was a physiologist, and he had written this beautiful paper, because he's a great writer. He had written this beautiful paper in Nature a long time ago, urging people like me, meaning geneticists, cell biologists, molecular biologists, to think about animals that we normally don't think about as model organisms. So the pythons is what he wrote this beautiful Nature article, and he pointed out some of the things that pythons can do that other animals can't. And without putting too much effort into thinking about how hard this might be to do, I got animal approval to bring some snakes. I probably had never even picked up a snake in my life. And I called this snake breeder in Oklahoma City, and I asked him if I could order 15 baby pythons. And he said, what are you going to do with 15 baby pythons? I said, I'm going to study their hearts. And it turns out that pythons, if they can go for well over a year without eating anything, and nothing bad happens to them. They are perfectly healthy. They do not lose muscle mass like mammals do if you don't eat anything. And yet they're not hibernating because they have to be able to strike prey, constrict, and kill it within seconds of seeing or smelling the prey. So they need to be ready to strike, because otherwise they might not eat another meal for another year. So it's an evolutionary adaptation for snakes to get as big as they can, as fast as they can. And so we started studying their hearts, and their hearts, when they eat a meal, get gigantic. They build new muscle. And within about 6 days, it goes back to almost their pre-eating state. And it does it in a way that's different than if you have untreated high blood pressure. So your heart gets big in a bad way if you have untreated high blood pressure, for example. The snake's heart looks much more like a highly conditioned athlete, which, of course, you know, cyclists, for example, have huge hearts, and many swimmers do as well. And that's in a good way. So your heart can get bigger in a bad way and in a beneficial way. The snake is doing it in a beneficial way, and bigger and more quickly than any mammal could do this. So we reasoned that if we could understand this, then we might be able to promote, in people with heart disease, you might be able to promote that kind of beneficial cardiac growth without having to be running marathons, because a lot of people with heart disease can't do that.
I see. Well, yeah, I mean, regarding the animal approval, how hard was it to get approval from ICUC to say, hey, can I get some pythons over?
So I'm glad you asked that question, because I probably never would have been able to do this, except there was a guy in the basement who worked on rattlesnakes. And rattlesnakes are venomous. I mean, pythons can kill you too, but just in a different way. And so I went downstairs and knocked on the door, and I introduced myself to this guy. And I said, can you help me figure out how to get animal approval to do these experiments? And he helped me. And in fact, he gave me a room to keep our pythons. And you can't keep venomous snakes in the same room as constricting snakes, because animal caretakers need to be able to know they're not dealing with venomous animals, or they are. So he had a whole bunch of rattlesnakes. He even had a cobra. So his snakes were actually really quite dangerous. So I think the animal committee was saying, oh, these aren't venomous snakes, so they're going to be easier and less dangerous.
And pythons aren't venomous.
They're not.
They're
I mean, they are, like, the way I think about pythons, they're the second longest, biggest snake in the world. Anacondas are the only snake that might be a bit bigger, but pythons can get to be 22 feet long, for example. Not in our facility. We keep them down to about 7 feet long, but they're big. And they're like, if you think about it, a snake is basically a tube of muscle, because their whole body is just a big muscle. And so they're very, very strong.
And I'd assume you have to get proper training to handle it. I mean, I'm wondering if you've handled it.
That's right.
So how was the handling the first time? Was it scary, kind of?
Well, I wasn't scared. My postdoc, however, was really scared. And so we sent her to the University of Alabama to learn how to dissect these snakes, to learn how to handle them, etc. And she actually, it wasn't too long before she wasn't afraid of them anymore. But she, you know, the way I think about this with the trainees who come through my lab, you need to have a healthy respect for them, because they will bite you. I mean, if you're not wearing, we have these metal gloves that they can't actually pierce through, but you know, to them, we're food. So they smell food and they will try to bite you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I know you said you were interested in genetics. So you think gene therapy could be the potential to combat cardiac hypertrophy, or do you think there's other options?
So conceivably, yes. I will say that whenever we discuss this at Myokardia, which we did from time to time, we felt that the expertise of the founders, as well as the scientists that we had hired, was in basic biochemistry and biophysics of these motor proteins. And we talked about it every time a new type of therapy might come down the road, we'd have another discussion about it. And I'm sure that that is going to be an approach that yields some therapies for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so another research you're doing is the MYH7B, the myosin gene family. Why are you so interested in this gene?
The 7B, that one?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, 7 is very closely related to it, and they're not the same gene. So I like things that sometimes don't fit into a box. And the 7B gene is interesting to us for probably 3 reasons. One is that it is one of the major myosins that's expressed in pythons, in python striated muscle. And in humans, it is barely expressed at the protein level, tiny amounts. And however, it is, when mutated, cause of hereditary hearing loss, which is very strange because this is a not classic, but mostly the type of myosin you can tell from its sequence and its function that is expressed in striated muscles. But in higher mammals or more complex mammals, it has been silenced to not make protein, but to make RNA. So there's a disconnect between the RNA and the protein. That was intriguing to me as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we're gonna move on. Let's talk. So I'm gonna take a turn of that. I think recently there was a 15% indirect funding cap for NIH. I'm just wondering, how has that been affecting you and your lab, or has that affected?
Yeah, so it hasn't yet happened. The university, all universities, I would say, are worried about this, worried tremendously, because it's what keeps the lights on, and the heater on in the winter, the air conditioning in the summer. The indirect cost rate at my university is a little over 56%. Others are higher, and there are others that are lower. So different universities have very different indirect cost rates. And so a number of things that the university relies on are going to go away if this goes down to 15%. So people are either putting their heads in the sand and saying, I'm not going to worry about it yet. I'm not one of those people. I like to plan. And so I did something that I've not ever done. I sat down my entire lab last week and went through our budgets, how much money we have, what are we going to do if we can't renew grants, for example, and what are we going to do if we can't rely on these indirect costs to, pay for the upkeep of our buildings, et cetera. So people at the higher administrative level, like the president and the provost and the chancellor, they're all worrying about this. They're making arguments. We, meaning the University of Colorado, signed on with 25 other universities to explain what a disaster this would be if we do have that come to pass. And so I'm worried at many levels, but that is kind of my job because I'm the chief scientific officer of this BioFrontiers Institute that is responsible for a lot of trainees. The graduate students are getting somewhat panicked. And again, others are not worrying about it yet. I think it would be silly to not worry about it myself. That's why I'm looking at stretching the dollars that we have as far as possible and trying to diversify my portfolio of grant funding by going to private institutes, foundations, American Heart Association, Muscular Dystrophy Association. But the biggest amount of money that we get is from the NIH. So,
and then, yes.
So I would say I'm worried.
Yeah, but and also how about young PIs? You probably have some young PIs who just have their labs.
So
how are they
the
feeling?
Ones, I'm probably the most worried about them, in the sense that we are running a search right now at the university because it was already planned a year ago, and we are just in the process of starting to make offers to them. And of course, when they came to interview, we all discussed this. And right now we have money to hire them as if this weren't happening. But they are worried. What happens if all of a sudden they take a job, they move their whole family here to Colorado, and now there's no grant money to be had. We will run out of money. I mean, there's no question about it if what's being predicted happens.
Mm-hmm. And let's say it eventually does happen. Let's hope it doesn't happen. What are some ways to replace that cost? Do you think the private industry, the biotechs, maybe venture capitalists should step up to pay the cost? Maybe they should provide some grants?
Well, so I'm already talking to my own company, but also another couple of companies making sponsored research agreements. That's how you bring money into the university, and it funds research that's of interest to the faculty members at the university, but also of interest to the company. So we can do these sponsored research agreements that will keep people's salaries going. And I'm actively pursuing several of those right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so, I also connected to this. Actually, I read there was a pre-seed venture fund called Altitude Labs. They're investing 100,000 to 250,000 in 10 to 15 biotech companies. So what happens is they're trying to replace the same SBIR grants from the new policy. Do you think with this type of strategy that Altitude is doing, do you think there's going to be other venture capitalists that are going to try to do the same, at least for these young biotechs that also depend on the grant money?
Everything feeds everything else, because I think some VCs and some biotech companies, or big pharma as well, recognize that they will lose their pipeline of talent to start new companies and to go work in new companies. If things are not being approved by the FDA, then the whole thing's going to fall apart. So if we don't train the next generation of scientists, it's going to take, I'd say, at least 2 to 3 generations before we will be able to build back up, if even then. Because, the US has, the NIH is the largest biomedical research source in the research support in the world. And if they do what they say they're going to do, that's going to destroy that stream of talent and ideas. So I think it's going to take a long time to recover from if this actually happens.
And do you think the research potential would go to other countries, maybe like China or Europe?
It's like we're giving them an incredible gift if this happens.
Yeah. So I also read you're a venture partner at Cataleo Capital Management. So I was wondering what is the role of a partner?
What's the role of
a venture partner, basically?
Yeah. So are you talking about Cataleo itself?
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. So I've still never been to a face-to-face meeting with them. I think that they have a model where they're hoping that people will put money into their fund, the people who are partnering with them, like me. And I have not yet done that. I think the idea is a good one. And one of the ideas that they and other people have been thinking about is, as you probably know, the tradition in biotech companies is that the founders usually go away after whatever period of time, and that founders usually have very, very low numbers of shares of stock compared to the people who come in after the company has been co-founded. I do think that that's not good, that that's what happens. And it turns out that the founders of Myokardia, we stayed involved through the entire process of going public. I used to be there once every 10 days for just a full day. Jim would come up from Stanford and I would go directly to the company, and we would spend an entire day talking to the scientists. We did not get involved in the business side of things except very rarely. And I think that we were not the typical model, though, because that continued for almost 12 years.
Yeah, so like in your case, do you usually leave when a company gets to a certain round? like for you specifically? Like when do you like go hands off kind of?
So at Myogen, I went hands off pretty quickly. We were already public by the time I not stepped aside exactly, but I wasn't there more than once every couple of months, maybe 6 months sometimes towards the end. And it was pretty clear that we were going to get bought. And that's exactly what happened. But I wasn't playing a role at the company by that time. At Myokardia, I was.
So you were there basically the whole phase of
The whole time
Myokardia.
until BMS bought the company.
Yeah. So when you guys went public, do you go to New York to like
Yeah, we
cut
all
the
went.
ribbon? Oh, really? So
Yeah.
how
So
was that experience?
It
Because I
was,
always see on TV. I see these new companies cutting the ribbon. They're all happy. Like,
yeah. So the founders, the CEO, the CMO. I mean, there were probably 25 of us, maybe 20 or 15 standing up at the podium. And it was kind of anticlimactic though, because all we did was push a button on a laptop and then confetti came down from the ceiling. But we had a great celebration. It was exhilarating to me because I had not gone when Myogen went public. It was only just the executives of the company.
but you went with Myokardia. So
Oh,
that
yeah.
was a
Yeah.
yeah. So what advice did you receive during your career that shaped your professional development or success?
So I'm not sure whether this came from me or somebody giving me advice, but I'll tell you what my biggest piece of advice that I give to anybody in an academic setting or a biotech setting is pick your battles. And I do a really good job of knowing things that I can't win, and I won't take on a battle I can't win. And there are all kinds of battles. They could be battles, with something like getting grant funds, getting your papers published, trying to raise money from VCs. And so I think that it's not that you're battling every day, but as you go up the ladder of running an institute, you do have battles every day. And I would do nothing except fight battles if I didn't pick them well. So I'm willing to let stuff go. I mean, if I can't solve a problem because it's not solvable. I remember, this is now quite a number of years ago, I was trying to get this building built that the Institute lives in now. And it was, in the end, I guess we moved in 2012. So in those days, dollars, it was about a $260 million building. And there wasn't space to put this huge building on main campus. So this CFO of the campus said to me, you can move off campus because we've got a lot of land out there. And I'll give you a week to decide if you want this new building, you're going to have to move off campus. And I talked to a bunch of people. And when I say move off campus, it literally is a 18-minute walk. I mean, but you have to cross a number of highways and things. And for some people, it's like moving 10 miles away, even though it's, less than a mile. And I had some distinguished professors, a Nobel laureate or two in the room with me. And they said, we don't want you to move off campus because you really need to be next to the physics department and the chemistry department. And there's nothing out there. And they said, but we have a solution for you. And I said, oh, good, tell me, because there's no space that I know of that we could move into. And he said to me, I'm not making this up, oh, it's easy. You just have to move the football stadium. And I just started laughing. And I said, is that a joke? And they said, no. And I said, well, I appreciate the fact that you think I'm powerful enough to get the football stadium moved, but that's a battle I cannot win. So no, I am not going to take that on. So that's an example of one of the more ridiculous things that anybody ever suggested to me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, actually, I just thought you say you had a fourth company that went out stealth. Do you mind sharing more about it?
About which?
You said there was a company that went out of stealth mode.
Oh, sure. It's called Kardigan.
See.
I'm smiling only because you probably can't see this, but the audience won't be able to know what it is, but it's the logo of our company. And you probably know that there's another word that sounds like cardigan that's a sweater. It's spelled differently. It's spelled Kardigan. And it is a new company that's still focusing on the heart. And it's formed by the former CEO of Myokardia, the former CSO, Chief Scientific Officer of Myokardia, and one of our clinicians involved deeply in running clinical trials in heart disease, myself, and Beth McNally, who's a very well-known cardiovascular MD PhD, who happened to train with me as an MD PhD student. She's director of regenerative medicine at Northwestern now. So those are the founders. We're in South San Francisco. It's really quite new in the sense that the labs aren't even finished being built. They haven't put the cold rooms there, but there's a physical plant in South San Francisco. And we've got, probably a couple of dozen scientists now. So it's not tiny, but it's still reasonably small.
Are you guys in series? What round are you guys in? Do you skip around again?
Oh, this is embarrassing, but it's public information, so I'll go ahead and tell you. Because this is now my third biotech company, the two before me were incredibly successful. Tassos, of course, was the CEO that sold the company to BMS, and Robert McDowell was our CSO at Myokardia. So we had a quite extraordinary reputation, and so we were able to raise $300 million in a fairly short period of time.
Oh, wow. Okay. That's good. All right. Yeah. Thank you very much for being on this episode. I think people should learn more about cardiology and also your companies.
Yes.